functional programming is predictable programming, let's say I call a function. I can predict what that function is going to return. It shouldn't do anything other than that. Functional programming makes sure that your code is easy to read, it is reusable, it's scalable, it's all the things that good code should be.
Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Paige Niederinghaus, and today we have Jemima Abu, Senior Product Engineer at CAIS, here to talk about her guide to functional programming. In this episode, Jemima and I talk about the concept of pure functions, the benefits of using functional programming in production code bases, and how to balance functional programming principles with real-world application requirements. So here's our episode with Jemima Abu. Hey everyone, I am Paige Niederinghaus, your host for today, and we have Jemima Abu, a senior product engineer at CAIS, here to talk about her guide to functional programming. Welcome to the show, Jemima.
Thanks, Paige. Glad to be here.
Well, we are very glad to have you on. Functional programming is something that I'm sure a lot of people are probably have heard about, but may not be so familiar with. So let's dive right into it. You defined functional programming as predictable programming. So maybe you can explain a little bit more of why predictability is so important in software development.
Yeah, sure thing. So basically, when I say functional programming is predictable programming, I just mean if you, let's say I call a function, I can predict what that function is going to return. So if I have a function called add2, that function should add 2 to whatever number I pass into it. It shouldn't do anything other than that. So that is basically the concept of functional programming. It's writing functions or programming in a way that ensures that your code is predictable. If that's clear enough.
So you talked about predictable or pure functions is another thing that people might be familiar with as a topic. Can you explain to listeners who are unfamiliar, how does that concept work, or what does it really mean when we talk about pure and impure functions?
Pure function is going back to the math example, and I think the reason I'll keep referring math so much is because functional programming is based in math. It basically means that when you're doing anything in math, it gives you the same result. It's not like physics where it's based on like pressure or gravity or things can change, right? So if I say 2 plus 2, it'll be 4. Whether it's in French, it's on top of a mountain, it's at the bottom of the ocean, 2 plus 2 will always be 4. So that's the same thing when we say a pure function. A pure function is something that it does what it's supposed to do and it doesn't do anything other than that. So if I say anything other than that, I mean it doesn't have side effects. Side effects is a common term in functional programming used to refer to anything other than the expected value. So for example, if I say 2 plus 2, I call my function add2, and I'm like, okay, what's 2 plus 2? And then the function gives me a balloon animal. That's fun and all, but that's not what the function is supposed to do. So basically, anything other than what the expected result of that function is a side effect. And any function that has a side effect is not a pure function, it's impure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea there.
So one of the other things that you mentioned was immutability as a way to improve your code quality. So how does immutability help with that code quality and also maintainability?
Yeah, sure. I think on that reason I did mention immutability is because I'm talking about functional programming from the aspect of JavaScript, and JavaScript is not a strongly typed language, and JavaScript it just lets you change things wishy-washy however you'd like, and that's why immutability is important because you should not be modifying things in functional programming basically. So let's go away from the math example and go to an actual web-based example. If I'm calling a user or something from a database and I'm like, okay, if this user returns the wrong password, then just add is authenticated false to that user. Mutating that value would mean that I have now updated the user value, which means that anywhere else in that code, if the user value is being called for something else, it'll basically return an error kind of thing. So immutability just means changing an original variable and affecting the actual variable itself. Okay, let's say we're in class and I give you my script because sometimes you want to give people you're like, oh, I forgot to do a homework yesterday, can I have yours? Like, and I'm like, oh, copy it but don't make it obvious, and then you start writing on my homework. You are mutating my homework at that point. So that's not a functional way of doing your assignment. A functional way of doing your assignment would be to basically copy everything in my homework into yours, and then you can make whatever changes you want there. So that way, neither of us feels the class. So that's the idea of functional programming. It's making sure that you are not mutating global variables because those can also cause side effects. Because once you start mutating variables, things aren't predictable in your code anymore. If you're changing something in one file, you have no idea how that's affecting something in another file. So that's just the general concept of immutability in functional programming.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking from personal experience, I have done that before where I have reversed lists or changed arrays of stuff and then wondered why this strange bug is happening in my code. So, yeah, make copies. mutate those instead. What are some of the common mistakes that JavaScript developers or regular just developers in general might make when they're trying to apply functional programming concepts in JavaScript? Because, like you said, it's not necessarily the first language that you think of when you think functional programming.
Yeah. I think when it comes to functional programming on JavaScript, for me at least, it tends to be more of a now, I feel like there's such a thing as trying to be too functional. So, for example, I could be writing a thing and I'm like, oh, I want to make this functional. I don't want it to have any side effects at all. So I start extracting all async calls to another helper folder or like a middleware folder. Because I'm like, no, my functions have to be like completely pure. They can't do anything else other than function. The fact is, in a large scale application, it's not feasible to have completely pure functions. Some functions, if I'm calling user authentication, it needs to make an asynchronous calls. Asynchronous calls in themselves are not pure because they are a side effect other than what the user is actually supposed to be doing. Because if it was pure, all it'd be doing is taking in the value and saying user is true or is false. But now it's making a request to a server, getting the response from that server, using that response to detect the server. So things like that. I think when it comes to certain like grand scale applications, it is fine to not have completely pure functions. The main idea is just to make sure that the code itself in the base layer, like simple programs, the simple functions that you write, those themselves are pure. But when you're expanding on it, you can fiddle with it a little bit.
That's the beautiful thing about writing code is that there are many ways to get to the same answer, and it's not it is important still, but it's not important that it be, like you say, absolutely perfectly pure from
Yeah.
top to bottom. All right, so that kind of actually feeds into the next question. When you were giving your talk, you mentioned that functional programming can sometimes feel like a longer way of writing code. So how do you balance the desire to have clean code with tight deadlines and real world situations?
Yeah, exactly. If we take the concept of dry, for example, like keeping your code reusable and ensuring that you're not repeating anything anywhere, while
Mm-hmm.
keeping code dry is great. Sometimes it's possible that you are over engineering a function just to make sure, oh, I don't want this, I want this thing to be reusable. So let me like put every single prop in here so I can use it in multiple places. Sometimes it's easier to just have two functions. It's the same thing with functional programming. While making sure that all your functions are pure, if it's necessary for that function to have a side effect and it would take you more time to extract that side effect, just leave the side effect in there. There's no like functional programming police that's going to lock you down because you left a side effect in your code. So I think it's more of like the actual idea of function. So for example, we have React. I think React is a great example of how functional programming works because React used to be object oriented because it used to use class components and now it's moved over to hooks. And then like React Redux, it works on principle of functional programming, which is why if you want to use an action, you cannot mutate a state directly in an action. If you want to carry out any side effects, you have to use middleware to handle that. So I think React is a great example of how functional programming works properly in JavaScript. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that all your React functional components don't have side effects. So just think of it in terms of if you are building a React functional component, ideally you would not be mutating states like global states in every single component. You just do it where necessary. So that is the concept of how functional programming works. It's like a as necessary thing, and then just follow it to make your code look nicer.
Good advice. So you mentioned that higher order functions like map, reduce, and for each are typical things that you might use in a daily JavaScript application. How did these functions contribute to writing better and more reusable code?
Anyone that started learning JavaScript with for loops, so it has to be like for let I equals to yeah. I think we all very much appreciate map and for each because
Yes.
not only is it better for the code itself, it's just easier to read. If you show me a
Mhm.
for loop as somebody that doesn't program, I'm like, I don't quite understand the concept of it. But with a map, it's like everything is included in the code. So once you know what a map is, you can start calling it everywhere. With a for loop, you're opening yourself up to possible issues. What if you forgot to put when I is equals to zero? So now your for loop is just continuing endlessly. But with map, it's like it will always be stuck to the actual array. So I think the concept of these higher order functions very great for functional programming. It's because it just makes sure that you are using the methods that help you avoid mutating your values. It's making sure you're using the methods that they in themselves are also pure functions because if I call the map, I'm expecting what it's going to return. So yeah, I think higher
Mhm.
array methods, huge fan of them.
Me too. Me too. So you talked a little bit about Redux just a minute ago. What are your take on some of the functional programming libraries for JavaScript? And that includes Redux, Ramda, Lodash. Do you use them personally?
Yeah, so I've only worked with React Redux personally. I am aware of Lodash, but I have not. Oh wait, no. I'm aware of Lodash, but I don't like using it because it felt like a very heavy library for, if I would use it for maybe like throttle or debounce. And I'm like, I don't need
Hmm.
all of that to do one thing. So I just started implementing my own throttle and debounce. But yeah, for Redux, I think, like I said, it's a great example. Redux was actually my introduction to functional programming because I started working with Redux and I started working with Epics. And that's when we had to be using middleware. And then I was trying to understand, like, why do I have to install a whole different thing just to handle an async function in a reducer? Why can't I just call it in the reducer? So that's how I started
Hmm.
looking at functional programming, and that's like my entire exposure to it. But yeah, I think like it's like these things are put in place because JavaScript itself is such a vast world of a programming language. You can really do whatever you want with JavaScript. So that's why sometimes it's nice having things that follow a particular structure to ensure that, all right, this thing is actually going to be predictable. It's not just going to be done however you want. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've used Lodash plenty of times in the past, but I think a lot of the things that Lodash used to be most used for have been built into the JavaScript language over the years. So you really needed a lot less than you used to. All right. So is there anything about functional programming that you wanted to touch on or make people aware of that we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, honestly, these are all great questions. Like I think it covered like the entirety of my talk. It's just I think the thing I just always try to say with functional programming is that it's not an idea of, oh, it's one paradigm versus the other. Like you can only use object oriented or you can only use functional. Use whatever you want. You're the one writing your code, do you? But it's just if you're working in a larger code base, and the idea of it for me is more of speaking to a larger code appeal. It's like following functional programming makes your code easier in the grand scheme. Because if you're working with a class component, oh, I'm importing this component, I have to extend the class, I have to import all the method that class uses, even though I'm not using those methods or not. If you're working in functional programming, it's you have one function each to import. You don't really need to import the whole damn thing. So it's just for me personally, with the projects I've worked on, functional programming just seemed like a great way to go, and it seemed like a fun talk, which is why I like giving it. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on it.
That's great. All right. So before we wrap up, we're going to head into a quick round. So just short, snappy answers. So why should devs care about functional programming?
Because it's how you write good code. But seriously, the functional programming makes sure that your code is easy to read. It makes sure that your code is reusable, it's scalable, it's all the things that good code should be. So why wouldn't you write it?
What is one thing that you wish you knew when you started with functional programming?
Yeah. So for me, it's more I'm more glad that I found out about functional programming than, oh, I wish I knew this when I actually started functional programming.
What is one of the most annoying JavaScript quirks, in your opinion?
You know, the issue is I'm thinking of everything. Everything I want to say, I'm like, I don't think that's so bad though. Because I was gonna be like, oh, it's not strongly typed. So for example, if I say let this equals to that, or if I say const, I can always reassign it everywhere. I don't think that's the
Mhm.
end of the world. Like, it's really more that's what ESLint is for. So I think my thing with JavaScript is I feel like maybe originally there might have been things that would have been annoying with it, but at this stage there has been so much change done in the ecosystem that it's like most of those annoyances have been fixed anyway. So honestly, I think it's a
Yeah.
pretty cool language. Not gonna lie.
Maybe the this keyword still.
It'll be fine.
All right, last one. What is the biggest mistake devs make when learning JavaScript?
I think this is speaking from a self-taught developer point of view. I feel like a problem is trying to feel like you have to know every framework. Like you start learning JavaScript, you're like, oh, I need to learn React, I need to learn Vue, I need to learn Angular JS. I can't, if I want to build a project, I need to use 10 different frameworks. You really don't. If you know JavaScript and you know the basics of JavaScript, pick one framework. It'll probably be React because that's the most popular one. But pick one framework, learn that, start building projects with that, get a job with that, and then go on from there. There's no need to know it. They release a new JavaScript framework every day. You're not going to know everything. So I think it's just important to like know the basics, know the best practices with this language, and you'll be fine.
All right, Jemima, it has been great talking to you. If people want to learn more about functional programming or get in touch with you, where are the best places that you recommend they go get
It's been
started?
so great talking to you, Paige, as well. Thank you so much for hosting this. If you want to reach out to me, the best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn because that is probably my most active social media right now, just sad. But yeah, it's Jemima Abu on LinkedIn. So feel free to send me a message, send me a connection request, and I'll be sure to reply you there.
Excellent. Thank you again for joining us on LogRocket. It's been a pleasure having you.
All right. Thanks for having me and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.